In a single day, something extraordinary happened. A sitting American president was defeated, not once, not twice, but on multiple fronts, all at the same time. Courts ruled against him. Allies turned their backs on him. A pope publicly called him a liar, and his own voters started seeing him in a way they never had before. This wasn't an ordinary bad day in politics. This was a day that revealed something much deeper. A pattern of a man who keeps setting traps and then walks straight into them himself. From the courtrooms of New York to the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, from the halls of the FBI to the ancient streets of Rome, the same story kept playing out over and over again. A president making bold moves, a president making loud promises, and then a president watching everything fall apart, not because his enemies were too strong, but because his own decisions kept coming back to haunt him. Tariffs declared unconstitutional, a ceasefire already broken, an FBI director carrying bottles of personalized bourbon on a government jet, a secret deal involving a Trump golf course in the middle of Syria, and a poll showing that 80% of his own voters were disturbed by what they saw. One day, all of this. And the deeper you look, the stranger it gets, because every single one of these disasters had one thing in common, and that's when everything began to shift. Every single one of these disasters was caused by the man himself, not by his opponents, not by the media, not by some hidden conspiracy, by Donald Trump. His own words, his own decisions, his own traps. And to understand how one president managed to collapse on so many fronts in a single day, you have to go back and understand how each trap was built piece by piece long before it was ever sprung. Start with the tariffs. When Donald Trump decided to take control of America's trade policy and impose sweeping tariffs on countries around the world, he did it with total confidence. He believed he had the power. He believed no one could stop him. But there was one problem. The United States Constitution, the very foundation of American law, had already settled this question over 200 years ago. The power to impose tariffs, to lay taxes and duties on trade, that power belongs to Congress, not the president. It had always belonged to Congress. And the people who made absolutely sure of that were not famous politicians or television personalities. They were quiet, dedicated staffers, men and women working late into the night on committees most Americans have never heard of. Senate Finance Committee, House Ways and Means Committee. 52 years ago, these people sat in rooms, argued over words, debated language, and carefully wrote a piece of legislation called the Trade Act of 1974. They chose every single word with precision. They knew the difference between the balance of payments and the balance of trade. They made sure the law reflected that difference. They never got applause. The public never knew their names. But what they built was so strong, so carefully constructed, that half a century later, a federal court picked up their work, read every word, and used it to strike down the most powerful tariff agenda in modern American history. The Court of International Trade ruled clearly. Donald Trump's tariffs were unconstitutional, illegal. And tonight, the federal government is in the process of refunding $166 billion in tariffs that were wrongly collected from American businesses and citizens. $166 billion gone because the words written by forgotten staffers in the middle of the night 52 years ago still held. But the tariff defeat was only the beginning of this day, because at the very same moment this ruling was landing, something else was happening thousands of miles away in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, where American Navy vessels were under attack. A ceasefire that Donald Trump had publicly celebrated, loudly promoted, and staked his credibility on was already breaking apart. And what followed next would only make things far more intense. On the 7th of May, United States Navy vessels were moving through the Strait of Hormuz, a critical waterway, one of the most strategically important passages in the entire world. Nearly a third of all the world's oil supply moves through that narrow stretch of water. And on that day, Iranian forces launched missiles, drones, and small boats directly at American ships. No American assets were struck. The Navy responded with defensive strikes targeting missile launch sites, drone facilities, and command and control locations. The military's official statement was clear and professional, but then Donald Trump got on the phone with a reporter and said something that no president in American history had ever said before. He called it a love tap. A love tap. Those were his exact words. Not a military response, not a defensive engagement, a love tap. And in those two words, something became very clear to a lot of people who were paying attention. This was not a president in control of the situation. This was a president afraid of what came next. because Donald Trump had previously made a very loud, very public promise. He had posted on social media that there would be no deal with Iran except unconditional surrender. All caps, exclamation mark. His words, his promise. And now Iranian forces had just fired on United States Navy vessels, broken the ceasefire he had celebrated, and his response was to call it a love tap and insist the ceasefire was still in effect. The same man who threatened to blow Iran off the face of the earth was now asking reporters to please not make this into a bigger deal than it was. And Iran was watching all of this. Iran could see exactly what was happening. And rather than backing down, Iran was getting bolder. It was not afraid. It had already told Saudi Arabia to deny American vessels the use of its airspace for the escort operation. Saudi Arabia, a country this administration had done everything possible to keep happy, said no. The escort operation came to a rapid stop. American sailors were put at risk, and the president said it was just a love tap. The ceasefire that was supposed to demonstrate American strength had become a public demonstration of something else entirely. And all of this was happening at the same time that the president's FBI director was making headlines for all the wrong reasons. Kash Patel, the man Donald Trump personally chose to lead the most powerful law enforcement agency in the United States, was in crisis mode. Not because of a national security threat, not because of a major criminal investigation, but because people inside the FBI were talking to reporters about what they were seeing. And what they were seeing was troubling. The Atlantic had reported that Patel had been handing out personalized bottles of his own branded bourbon to FBI staff and to civilians he met during official duties. On a government jet, paid for by taxpayers. The bottles had his name on them, his personal brand, his logo on FBI insignia. And when the Atlantic published this story, Patel sued them. He filed a lawsuit against one of America's most respected publications, claiming the reporting was false. But then the Atlantic did something remarkable. They produced the bottle. An actual physical bottle of Kash Patel's personalized bourbon that they had purchased from someone who said Patel had given it to them at an event in Las Vegas. And the FBI, rather than denying the story, effectively confirmed it. Their response said that senior bureau officials have long exchanged commemorative items in formal gift settings. That was their defense. Everybody does it, but everybody does not do it. Robert Mueller, one of the most respected FBI directors in history, was a man so disciplined that his staff had to remove the words "I and me" from his speeches because he refused to talk about himself. The FBI has strict rules about alcohol. Agents are armed. They must be ready to respond to a national security crisis at any moment. There is no room for any of this. And yet, here was the director of the FBI, flying around the world on a government jet with cases of personalized bourbon, handing bottles to people he met at events, while simultaneously ordering the polygraphing of more than 24 current and former members of his own security detail, trying to find out who was leaking information about his behavior to the press. He was in panic mode, completely paranoid, isolating himself in his office, refusing to speak to senior officials inside the bureau because he didn't know who he could trust. The man running the FBI was afraid of his own staff. And Donald Trump, who had watched his own older brother slowly destroyed by alcoholism, who had never once taken a drink in his entire life, was now watching his own FBI director publicly appear to be struggling with exactly that. People around Trump reportedly wanted Patel gone. Trump reportedly wanted Patel gone, but here was the trap again. The moment Donald Trump fired Kash Patel, the loudest cheers would come from the people Trump hates most, the people who have never voted for him. And Donald Trump would rather keep a failing, embarrassing FBI director in his position than give his critics anything to celebrate. So Patel stayed trapped in his office, ordering polygraphs, while cases of bourbon sat in the cargo hold of a government jet. And somewhere in the middle of all of this, a story was quietly emerging out of the ruins of Syria that would make everything else look simple. Syrian-born billionaire brothers had been working Washington with a very specific strategy. They needed American sanctions on Syria lifted. They had $12 billion in reconstruction contracts lined up and ready to go, but they needed the sanctions gone first. And they needed the right door opened. A Republican congressman gave them a piece of advice that was remarkable in its directness. He told them, if you want to get the president's attention, propose a Trump national golf course in Syria. And the brothers were already ahead of that. They had already planned to propose a Trump-branded resort. And at the same time, two of the older brothers were in active negotiations with Ivanka Trump and Jared Kushner for a multi-billion-dollar resort project in Albania. Business and diplomacy completely blurred together. A carved stone was presented to the congressman. It had the Trump family emblem on it. It was celebrating the proposed golf course. Weeks later, Congress passed legislation for permanent sanctions repeal. The president signed it into law, and the same family that had lobbied for the policy change was already positioned to collect billions in contracts the moment those sanctions were lifted. A Pulitzer Prize winning team at the New York Times had documented all of it. Cryptocurrency deals worth over $1 billion. Agreements with Saudi Arabia and the UAE that raised national security questions inside the White House itself. A pattern so consistent, so wide, and so deeply embedded in the second term of this presidency that investigators, historians, and journalists were all struggling to keep up with the volume of it. And just when it seemed like things could not possibly get worse, the war with the Pope took a turn that no one inside the White House had prepared for, because the Pope decided he was done staying quiet. And what happened next completely changed everything. Pope Leo had watched long enough. For weeks, Donald Trump had been publicly attacking him, misrepresenting his words, and telling the world that the Pope believed it was acceptable for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. It was a lie. A clear, deliberate, and easily verifiable lie. The Catholic Church had spent years on record opposing all nuclear weapons, every country, every situation, no exceptions. The Pope had never said what Trump claimed he said, but Trump kept saying it anyway, because that is what Trump does. If someone criticizes you, you attack them. No person too small, no person too big, no person too sacred. And so the most powerful religious leader on earth, the spiritual head of over 1 billion Catholics worldwide, was forced to do something no pope had ever had to do in response to an American president. He called him out directly. Pope Leo stated clearly, if someone wants to criticize me, let them do so truthfully. The church has spoken against all nuclear weapons for years. It was not a lengthy speech. It was not a complicated statement. It was simple, direct, and devastating. Because it did not just correct the record, it told the world in plain language that the President of the United States was lying. And the world heard it. Back in Washington, the numbers were already telling a story that no political opponent of Trump had ever been able to tell. A Washington Post poll asked Americans about Trump posting that he did not want a pope who supported Iran having a nuclear weapon. 57% of Americans said they had a negative reaction. But that was not the number that mattered most. Because buried deeper in that same poll was something far more significant. 87% of Americans said they had a negative view of Donald Trump, depicting himself as Jesus Christ in an image he had promoted. 87%. That is not a political number. That is a human number. That crosses every party line, every demographic, every divide. And the number that should have shaken the White House to its foundation was this one. 80% of the people who had voted for Donald Trump in 2024, his own voters, the people who had chosen him, supported him, defended him, 80% of them looked at that image and felt something was deeply wrong. No opponent had ever achieved that. No investigation, no protest, no newspaper front page had ever moved Trump's own voters to look at their president with that kind of unease. But Trump had done it to himself with his own image, his own post, his own decision. And so Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, a man who had been Catholic, then Mormon, then evangelical, and was now Catholic again, was sent to Rome on a peace mission. Something no American president had ever needed to do before. Sent to quietly repair a relationship that never needed to be broken in the first place. A relationship that Trump himself had destroyed with one lie repeated too many times. And in Rome, in Washington, in the Strait of Hormuz, in the courtrooms of New York, in the corridors of the FBI, the same truth was becoming impossible to ignore. Every crisis on this single day traced back to the same source. Every trap had been built by the same hands. And even after that moment of reckoning, even after courts ruled, even after the Pope spoke, even after the polls delivered their verdict, the consequences were far from over. Because the consequences of one man's decisions do not disappear when a single day ends. They build, they compound. They spread in ways that cannot always be predicted or controlled. The tariff refunds had begun. $166 billion flowing back out of government accounts, a direct financial consequence of a president who never understood the law he was trying to use. The Court of International Trade had ruled again, striking down another set of tariffs, and the words of forgotten staffers from 52 years ago were still doing their quiet, powerful work long after those staffers had gone home and the cameras had moved on. In the waters near the Strait of Hormuz, American sailors remained on alert. Iran had fired, the Navy had responded, and the official position of the United States military was that it did not seek escalation, not unconditional surrender, not the total destruction Trump had promised. Just, please do not do it again. Gas prices were already 50% higher than before this war began, and Trump had told the American people that even if they doubled, it would be worth it. The American people were not so sure. Across the country, families filling up their tanks were doing the math, and the math was not adding up to anything that felt worth it. Inside the FBI, an agency built on discipline, service, and the absolute requirement of public trust, men and women were showing up to work every day under a director who was polygraphing his own staff, hiding in his office, and handing out branded bourbon bottles on taxpayer-funded flights. The agents, the analysts, the people who had dedicated their careers to protecting this country deserved better than this. The public deserved better than this. And somewhere in the ruins of Syria, a carved stone with the Trump family emblem sat on a congressman's desk, a symbol of just how completely the line between personal profit and public duty had been erased. The New York Times team that had spent months documenting all of it had won a Pulitzer Prize. But prizes do not fix policy. Prizes do not return the credibility that has been lost. Prizes do not rebuild the trust that has been broken with allies, with institutions, with the American people themselves. What this day revealed, more than anything else, was something simple and something devastating. A president who keeps building his own traps and then acts surprised when they close around him. Courts, the Constitution, a pope, his own voters, all of them arriving at the same conclusion from completely different directions. And the question that hangs over all of it is not whether these traps will keep appearing. They will. The question is, what happens when there is no more room left to escape? This story is far from finished, and every development matters. If this gave you something to think about, share your thoughts in the comments below, because conversations like this one are exactly what this moment in history demands. If you found this powerful, hit that like button and make sure you are subscribed, because the stories that are coming next are ones you will not want to miss.